The Pokédex is one of the most iconic elements of the Pokémon franchise, outside of the actual Pokémon themselves. I always loved the designs of these things, and how they embodied the clunky, plastic, retrofuturism aesthetic of the early Pokémon world. I think my favourite designs have to be the Gen 4 Sinnoh Pokédex, which is clearly taking inspiration from the Nintendo DS, and of course the Gen 6 Hoenn Pokédex, which is obviously just a Game Boy Advance. I also think it's criminal that the modern day Pokédex has just been reduced to a smartphone with an annoying sentient creature trapped inside it, but that's a tangent for another day. Today, I don't want to talk about the physical device, I want to talk about the Pokédex, as in the complete encyclopedia of all known Pokémon, ranging from 1996 to 2024, and that's precisely where the problem begins. You see, the National Dex has never actually been reordered, only expanded. When a new generation of Pokémon is created, every new Pokémon is assigned a number, and that new region is then stapled onto the back of the existing Pokédex. And while the ordering of these new Pokémon generally makes sense within their own generation, it quickly falls apart when added to the full Dex. As someone with a complete living Dex, I've organised mine in their National Dex order, and as a sorting system it feels very unintuitive. For example, if I wanted to grab the Mankey family for something, I would get Mankey and Primeape together at numbers 56 and 57, and then I'd have to go all the way to slot 979 to find Annihilape. As new generations have expanded upon the families of existing Pokémon, it's caused the ordering of the Pokédex to become completely inefficient as an encyclopedia, and that's what I'm going to try and fix. In order to make my decisions, I'm also going to consider what would make sense from an in-universe perspective, as if I was an actual researcher trying to organise this catalogue of weird creatures in the most effective way possible, using whatever information and logic would be available to me. First off, the biggest decision we have to make is how we're going to reorganise the Pokédex. To start with, let's take a look at Kanto. This Pokédex is of course the original, so it only makes sense that we use this dex as the foundation on which to assemble our new and improved National Pokédex. The ordering of the Kanto Pokédex also established a lot of unspoken rules that many other regional Pokédexes would adhere to. Most obviously, every regional Pokédex begins with the starter Pokémon in the order of Grass, Fire, and Water, and no, I'm not going to call them first partner Pokémon. Stop trying to push first partner Pokémon, it's not going to happen, it's not going to catch on, just call them starters. Everyone already calls them starters, why do you need to? Each regional dex also tends to put common early route Pokemon near the beginning, while rare, legendary, and one-of-a-kind Pokemon go at the end. I could try and consolidate the dex into one big version of a regional dex by putting every starter at the beginning and every legendary at the end, but I think using legendaries and starters as bookends for different regions is a good idea, as it provides us with a structure for which everything else can be put inside. Another obvious rule is that evolutionary families are grouped together. This common sense rule is honestly the main reason I wanted to do this, as it's the most logical and obvious part of the original Pokédex that got thrown out the window when Johto's dex was added onto it. New evolutions like Scizor and Steelix were completely separated from their pre-evolutions, and some Pokemon like Chansey, Magmar and Electabuzz have both evolutions and pre-evolutions that are spread across 3 entirely different regions. Aside from that, the ordering of the Pokemon within each region is mostly arbitrary. It does seem to arrange Pokemon in roughly the order you'd expect to encounter them in as you go through the game, but there are some outliers like Magikarp being at the very end, or Geodude being near the middle. But unless I have a solid justification for reorganising something, I'm happy to leave them be. With that out of the way, let's get to work. Since we're using this as a guidance for the other parts of our revised Pokédex, the Kanto portion is going to remain mostly identical in order, and mostly involves the addition of many new evolutions and forms that have been discovered over the years. If we look at this from a real-life scientific standpoint, regional forms wouldn't actually qualify as different species, as one of the primary definitions for a new species is being biologically incompatible with other species in its genus. However, when it comes to Pokemon, they have very broad groups for breeding compatibility, so I don't think we can really use this as a definition of species. Instead, we can simply go by the fact that they've clearly developed new and unique traits as a result of their environment. As for their places, I'm going to add them after the evolution lines of their original forms, with any regional exclusive evolutions like Sirfetch'd and Berserker following suit. This works out nicely considering how certain regional evolution lines work. Kanto Rattata can't evolve into Alolan Raticate, so I might as well put Alolan Rattata after Kanto Raticate, whereas Kanto Cubone can evolve into either Kanto or Alolan Marowak based on its environment, so putting those two together works in the same way as listing other branching lines like Poliwhirl or Gloom's evolutions. But there is one radical change that I think needs to be made, a change that Game Freak has been too scared to commit to, and that is consolidating Nidoran into a single entry. Nidoran is a remnant of how limited Generation 1 was. In the world of Pokemon, gender wasn't discovered until Generation 2, and you weren't even allowed to choose one for yourself until Crystal. Nidoran was the only Pokemon with an obvious gender dimorphism, one that resulted in 2 distinct evolution lines. Looking at this from an in-universe perspective, you could imagine that maybe during the creation of the original Pokédex, the idea of Pokemon having separate genders wasn't even considered. and since Nidoran was the only obvious example, they ended up being classified as two separate species to explain why one set of Nidoran evolved into Nidokings and the other evolved into Nidoqueens. But in terms of game mechanics, this was likely done because the concept of genders and gender-based evolutions was beyond the scope of what could be programmed within Generation 1, and coding them as two separate isolated evolution lines was the easier solution. As such, Nidoran male and Nidoran female were given two separate slots in the Pokédex, being identified in-game with the male and female symbols at the end of their names. But when Generation 2 came out, the gender update dropped for all Pokémon, classifying them as either male, female, or a secret third thing. And yet, Nidoran remained as two separate species. Perhaps because they still hadn't figured out how to do split evolutions based on gender, as Generation 2 didn't include any evolutions like this, and likely only introduced gender so the breeding mechanic could make sense. But then we reached Generation 4, which included Burmy as the first Pokemon with a branched evolution based on its gender. In fact, Burmy is actually the only Pokemon that has a split line exclusively for male and female forms, as males evolve into Mothim and females into Wormadam. All other evolution methods that take gender into account either have one form exclusively for one gender and a second form that can be both, or in the case of Combee and Salandit, only allowing one gender to evolve. This generation also introduced visible gender differences for many other species of Pokemon, so at this point it should have been possible for Nidoran to be implemented as a single species. And while it's possible that making this change could affect Nidoran from being transferred up from previous generations, I suspect the real reason Nidoran remained a split species is because of brand identity, as moving Nidoran into a single slot would reduce the number of Pokemon in the Kanto Pokédex. Every Pokemon from number 32 onward would have their Pokédex number changed, and the original 151 would now only be 150. This is also a likely reason why the National Dex has never been reorganised like this, as the National Dex numbers are also part of a Pokemon's branding and identity, especially when it comes to Kanto Pokemon. But in light of Generation 2, Nidoran are clearly intended to be the same species, as any egg that would produce Nidoran has an equal chance of being either male or female. So while these two Pokemon do qualify as distinct forms due to their stat differences and different move pools, the new Dex will officially consider them as the same species, placing the Nidoran and Nidorino lines afterwards. Speaking of Pokemon that look alike, Generation 9 introduced us to the convergent Pokemon Wiglett and Toedscool, and while it would be tempting to put them next to Diglett and Tentacool, the point of convergent evolution is that they are not in fact related. The ideas behind regional forms and convergent Pokemon are based on real-life biology. Regional forms represent when animals of the same species have branched off by adapting to different environments, while convergent evolution is where two unrelated species happen to evolve in the same way. A good example of this in the real world would be dolphins and sharks. Both have fins in nearly identical shapes and locations, but dolphins are air-breathing mammals and sharks are entirely aquatic, as they both evolved from completely different ancestors. Pokemon's take on convergent evolution is less grounded in reality than regional forms though, as Wiglett and Toedscool just happen to superficially resemble other Pokemon while existing in completely different environments to them. Either way, these lines are undeniably Paldean, so I'll be keeping them in their respective part of the Pokedex. On the topic of Paldea, I also have to decide what to do with the Paradox Pokemon, all of which are clearly based upon and allegedly evolved into or evolved from existing Pokemon. Depending on your interpretation of Scarlet and Violet's main story, these Pokemon are either created from fiction and imagination, or pulled from alternate reality timelines, so whether or not Screamtail is actually related to Jigglypuff is sort of debatable. While it could be feasible to include ancient ancestors, the addition of future robot versions is where things get kind of absurd from a scientific standpoint. So I'm going to keep both sets of Paradoxes in Paldea, as to me it makes more sense for them to be grouped together as their own separate categories alongside Koraidon and Miraidon. And as we reach the end of the Kanto Dex, we find the three legendary birds, Articuno, Zapdos and Moltres, followed by the Dratini line, Mewtwo and Mew. And while I did say that I wanted to keep the order of the Kanto Dex mostly untouched, there are a few changes I'd want to propose here. These Pokemon represent four separate classifications: Sub-Legendary, Pseudo-Legendary, Legendary, and Mythical. And with the exception of Sub-Legendary, Pokemon belonging to these groups have appeared in every generation since. Sub-Legendary is a fan term often used to describe the legendary Pokemon that aren't restricted from certain battle modes. And Pseudo-Legendary is another fan term given to Pokemon that have 3 stages, a slow experience curve, and a final form with a base stat total of 600. While this is a fan classification, it is based on an existing pattern, with there being a Pokemon in every generation that conforms to this design blueprint, and these Pokemon have often been depicted together in merchandise such as the Late Bloomer collection. Restricted legendary Pokemon are some of the most powerful within each generation. They're sometimes referred to as the box legendaries, as they are often version exclusives and used as the face of each game version since Gold and Silver. And last of all, we have the Mythicals, extremely rare Pokemon that are usually only available from special events or distributions. This same layout of legendary Pokemon is also used in the Johto Pokédex, with Raikou, Entei and Suicune appearing before Larvitar, which is then followed by Lugia, Ho-Oh and the mythical Celebi. But once we get to Generation 3, the two pseudo-legendaries Bagon and Beldum appear ahead of the sub-legendaries. Then Generation 4 threw the whole thing out of the window and put Gible in the middle of the decks, put two sub-legendaries in the middle of their legendary trio, and then another sub-legendary right before the Mythicals, and they didn't even put it next to the Mythical that it's thematically associated with. Generation 5 even put a Mythical at the start of their Pokédex ahead of its starter Pokémon, as well as separating a sub-legendary trio just so they could use it to also separate the main legendary trio. Can you see where I'm so frustrated by this? Since we've already tarnished the supposed sanctity of the Kanto decks by reordering Nidoran, I'm going to say that Hoenn did it best by putting the pseudo-legendaries first, followed by the sub-legendaries, main legendaries, and the Mythicals, and we're going to use that as our ordering convention going forwards. But I'm also going to immediately break from that to put Mew ahead of Mewtwo. Mythicals appearing at the very end of the decks is a logical game design choice, as it means that there won't be any blank gaps in your Pokédex for a Pokémon that is potentially unobtainable, but this only works on a regional basis, as once you start looking at the national decks in Generation 2, there's now a gap between Mewtwo and Chikorita that can't normally be filled. And from the perspective of this being an in-universe encyclopedia of Pokémon, it makes absolutely no sense for Mewtwo to be there before Mew, considering that knowledge of Mew obviously predates that of its genetic clone. In general, I will be keeping the Mythicals at the end of the decks, but I do have a few other exceptions in mind that I plan to rearrange. Moving into the Johto decks, and this one is also mostly the same in terms of order. Despite several baby Pokemon and new evolutions being moved backwards to Kanto, the size of this deck is still larger than it was before, thanks to several Johto Pokemon getting their own evolutions and regional forms, like Hisuian Typhlosion, Togekiss, Azurill, and Clodsire. Heading down a few more entries, I'm going to make another slight adjustment here by moving Delibird out of the way, so that Mantine can be next to Remoraid and Octillery. Remoraid is likely named after the Remora, which is the type of fish that forms symbiotic relationships with larger creatures like sharks and manta rays. The larger host protects the Remora from predators, and in return the Remora will eat parasites that would affect the host. This relationship is also present between Remoraid and Mantine, as in Generations 2 and 3, Mantine's sprite was always depicted as having a Remoraid underneath its wing, and its Generation 4 pre-evolution Mantike can only evolve when Remoraid is in the party. On the topic of Pokemon that are considered related or have an established dynamic, some would argue that Heracross is the counterpart to Pinsir, or that Miltank is the female counterpart to Tauros, and that putting them together in the decks would make sense in the same way that Plusle and Minun or Solrock and Lunatone are together despite not being part of an evolutionary family. And in general, I would agree, but connections like these can be subjective, and I'd rather keep those Pokemon within their original regions if there isn't a direct connection to be made with a Pokemon from earlier in the decks. In addition to moving Larvitar ahead of the Johto beasts, I'm also going to be moving Sudowoodo down to the very end, as while it does appear much earlier in the game, Sudowoodo in Generation 2 does serve a similar role to Snorlax, as a roadblock in the story that also can't be found normally in the wild, so it just feels right putting it in the same spot. As the only Pokemon added in Generation 3 with ties to a previous generation were Wynaut and Azurill, the Hoenn dex remained remarkably intact, and only has a few new additions such as Obstagoon, Probopass, Gallade and Frostlass. Keeping with the Kanto layout, I'm moving Castform, Lileep, Anorith and Kecleon to the back of the decks, as they respectively serve as the Gift, Fossil and Roadblock Pokemon of this generation. We also get our first cross-regional family that aren't evolutionarily related, but are impossible to dispute as a connected unit. The Regi trio are now also joined by their Galarian brothers and Regigigas, as keeping legendary groups like this together feels like an obvious decision. Unlike Hoenn, Sinnoh on the other hand is now much smaller, thanks to all of the cross-regional evolutions being relocated. Of those that remain, I've moved Shieldon and Kratos to the back along with Gible to keep up with the fossil and pseudo-legend patterns, but the main area that needs reorganising here is the legendaries. Sorting the Mythicals, sub-legendaries and legendaries here feels a bit tricky, not just because there's so many of them, but many of these legendaries are interconnected to each other through myths and themes. The sub-legendary Lake Spirits are tied to the legendary Dialga, Palkia and Giratina through their connection to the Red Chain and the story of the Sinnoh region, while in turn this legendary trio is obviously connected to the mythical Arceus that created them, so putting all of them together makes logical sense. However, it would also be fitting for Cresselia and Darkrai to be together as counterparts, since they can be found on neighbouring islands and Cresselia's feathers are used as the cure for Darkrai's nightmares. Since Regigigas is away with its children under the Hoenn region, that leaves Heatran to go first, followed by Cresselia and Darkrai, then Fion, Manaphy and Shaymin, and then capping off with the 6 legendaries most closely ingrained in the history of the Sinnoh region with Arceus at the very end. I suppose I should probably address this now since we're on the topic, and I have been getting comments about it in previous videos, but yes, I do say it as Arceus. Yes, I do know that Arceus is probably the correct pronunciation. No, I'm not going to start saying it differently. No, this is not open for debate. If it's good enough for Battle Revolution, it's good enough for me. Moving on.
Arceus is sent out.
Unova was a region with a very strong sense of identity, as its regional Pokédex was made up entirely of brand new Pokémon. In the original Black and White, it wasn't even possible to encounter Pokémon from previous generations until you beat the main story, and the dex itself contained absolutely no evolutions, pre-evolutions, or new forms for any existing Pokémon, making it the first and currently only dex since Kanto to do this. As such, the contents of this dex is only really changed by the addition of a few new Pokémon from Galar, Hisui, and Paldea, like Runerigus and King Gambit. And as for the ordering, I only really have a few suggestions. Move Shelmet next to Carablast, move Zorua, Archon and Turtoga near the end, put Larvesta before Dino, group Keldeo with the Swords of Justice, slide Landorus and Enamorus with the other genies, and put Victini with the other two Mythicals. I do like the gimmick of Victini being Pokemon number 0 within its own regional dex, but having it come between Arceus and Snivy in the national dex really messes with the whole ordering system and makes it look like one of Sinnoh's Mythicals. At this point we can start to speed through the remaining Pokedexes, as there aren't many more changes I need to make now that almost all of the cross-regional evolutions and regional forms have been relocated. And going from the largest new regional dex to the smallest, Kalos also has very few changes made to its lineup. The only cross-regional evolution that needs to be removed is Sylveon, and the only new forms are those of Hisui and Avalugg, Sliggoo and Goodra. As you can probably guess by now, we'll be moving Tyrant, Amora and Gumi to the back, right next to Xerneas and Yveltal, since Kalos is the first and only region not to introduce any new Pokemon that will be classified as sub-legendary. And since they are canonically a related species, I'll be putting Carbink at the very end of this dex next to Diancie, as Diancie is widely accepted to be a mutated variant of Carbink. With no fossil Pokemon in the Alola region to be relocated, we can jump straight into the large assortment of legendaries. While officially classified as Ultra Beasts, these extra-dimensional friends are functionally similar to sub-legendaries, as well as showing a connection to the main legendaries of this generation, which also came from the dimensions beyond our own. So moving Type Null next to Kommo-o and putting the Ultra Beasts between the Tapus and the Cosmog seems fitting. We also need to deal with the fallout of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. These games introduced 5 new Pokemon that weren't present in Sun and Moon, which simply got slapped onto the back of the Alola dex, so Stakataka, Blacephalon and Poipole need to be moved alongside the other Ultra Beasts. I decided to put Poipole and Naganadel at the front, as Poipole is described as equivalent to a starter Pokemon within Ultra Megalopolis, and then Blacephalon and Stakataka can go after Kartana. Guzzlord gets to stay at the end, as it was treated as the sort of final boss of the Ultra Beasts during the event of Sun and Moon. Despite it not being as competitively threatening as some of the other Ultra Beasts, I think it earns that spot by being a member of the exclusive Pokemon with a confirmed kill count club. And for the final entry, I'll be keeping Meltan and Melmetal here at the end of the Alola dex. These two Goobas exist in kind of a weird place, as they were first introduced in Pokemon Go in the time between generations 7 and 8. While Go would be their original game, the world of Go also exists in sort of a nebulous space, as while elements of Go such as Professor Willow have been established as canon, Go isn't confirmed to be set in any officially defined region within the Pokemon world. The in-game Pokédex in Go also classified Meltan and Melmetal as being from an unknown region, which isn't very helpful. We could argue for them to be classified as Kanto Pokemon, since Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee allows them to be transferred in, but blocks any other Pokemon that isn't either a Kanto native or an Alolan variant of one. But while they weren't available in any of the Alola games, we do see them appear in this region in the anime, so there is precedent for Meltan first being officially recorded here, even if it wasn't possible in the games due to Pokemon not being able to transfer from Go to the 3DS. Galar is another list that requires very little revision. While Duraludon does appear in between the Galarian fossils and the regional pseudo-legend, it does potentially have a claim to be there thanks to Archaludon. While most people don't consider it to be a pseudo-legendary, there is a separate term used in the Japanese fanbase called the 600 Club. The requirements for joining the 600 Club are simply being a non-mega, non-mythical and non-legendary Pokemon with a base stat total of 600. And for a while, the overlap between pseudo-legendaries and the 600 Club was a perfect circle, as no other Pokemon met these specific requirements until Indigo Disc. Archaludon is a non-legendary with a base stat total of 600, but it's only a 2-stage Pokemon with a faster experience curve than the other pseudo-legends, making it the first Pokemon to cause a rift between the pseudo-legendaries and the 600 Club. Much like we did with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, we also need to reorganise the legendaries that got added with Sword and Shield's DLCs, placing Kubfu, Urshifu, Glastrier, Spectria and Calyrex between Dragapult and Zacian, while moving Zarude, the only Gen 8 mythical, to the very end. Thankfully, the Hisui part of the dex has already been completely relocated, as it consisted entirely of regionals and new evolutions for existing families, which just leaves us with the Paldea dex. While these last few regional dexes have been fairly organised so far, the final part of the Paldea dex is frankly a complete mess. After all of the new evolutions, we have the past and future Paradox Pokemon, the pseudo-legendary, and then Gimmighoul and Goldengo, which were seemingly placed here to officially be Pokemon number 999 and 1000, which I can honestly give a pass to. Then we have the sub-legendary Treasures of Ruin, followed by 2 more Paradox Pokemon, which clearly got shuffled back so Gimmighoul and Gholdengo could take the spotlight. Lastly, we have the main legendaries Koraidon and Miraidon, and then this is where it loses any semblance of logical structure. Because first you have Walking Wake and Iron Leaves, then 3 regular Pokemon, 4 more legendaries, 2 more regular Pokemon, one of which is the evolution of a Pokemon that just got added and is now 7 spaces further down the decks, and then the Paradox versions of Entei, Raikou, Terrakion and Cobalion, which are not only completely separated from their Suicune and Virizion counterparts, but aren't even in the same numerical order as their counterpart trios. I mean, I get the appeal of adding new Pokemon over the course of a generation with updates and DLC, but would it kill them to just wait until they finished adding them all before deciding on their official placement in the decks? Instead of just adding them as they went along, would it have been so hard to just put Dipplin and Hydrapple together? Alright, we can still salvage this. First off, I'm going to move Wattrel and Kilowattrel next to Squawkabilly, and then put Gimmighoul and Gholdengo after it. If my count is correct, this should be the new locations of Pokemon number 999 and 1000, since counting regional forms as their own Pokemon has increased the total number in our national decks by about 60. And while it does take a while to evolve one, you do see Gimmighoul as early as the first route in Paldea, even if they aren't catchable, so having them close to the start of the Paldea decks isn't too out of place. The same goes for Wattrel, as while it isn't available immediately in the first area of the game, it is the closest thing Paldea has to the regional bird archetype. After that, let's restructure what's left at the end of the decks. Our Chaladon, Dipplin and Hydrapple have already been relocated to the Galar decks, so that just leaves Poltergeist to be integrated into the latter half of the Paldea decks. Although it isn't technically found in Paldea, there is precedent for Pokemon in a region's Pokedex to not be native to that region. Several Johto Pokemon are actually first found in Kanto, and there's a handful of Pokemon that are only obtainable as gifts or through special events within their debut games, and don't actually appear anywhere in the wild until future regions. To name some examples, Sneasel is only found on Route 28 and inside Mount Silver, and Houndour is found all the way over in Route 7, both on the Kanto side of Generation 2. And despite being a Sinnoh Pokemon, Riolu is only found as an egg, and can't be found in the wild until Challenger's Cave in Unova. It can also be found in the Safari Zone in Johto, but the whole idea of a Safari Zone sort of implies that it's a special habitat for Pokemon that might not necessarily be native to the region, especially in the case of the Johto Safari Zone, which is an entirely artificial environment. I did consider moving Pokemon like these to the decks of the first region where they could be naturally found in the wild, but that would have complicated things when it came to certain Pokemon such as Mythicals, since we don't really know where Pokemon like Jirachi, Volcanion or Zarude could be found, as they've never appeared anywhere in the wild before. In addition, this would also make it less intuitive to locate certain Pokemon when using the decks to look them up, which is precisely what I'm trying to avoid. And as I was writing this script, I also saw that another creator is doing precisely that for each region of the decks, so I'll avoid stepping on their toes and just tell you to go check them out if you're interested in that concept. For the legendaries, we're going to move the Kitakami sub-legendaries next to the Paldean Treasures of Ruin, along with their mythical overlord Petulant at the back and the misunderstood Ogre up front, since we know its appearance in Kitakami predates the other 4. After that, we have the Scarlet Paradoxes grouped together, including the Johto Dinosaurs and Koraidon, followed by the Violet Paradoxes with the Borgs of Justice and Miraidon. In addition to reuniting these two trios, I also reordered them to match the deck's order of their counterparts. And of course, at the very end of our entire decks, in the final slot is Terapagos, the titular Indigo Disc, and as of recording, the final legendary of this generation. With our decks order finished, let's take a look at some of the figures. Our total revised Pokédex is now at 1,083 distinct entries, with 59 additional forms being given their own entries, and one species being reclassified as a form. Kanto has also overtaken Unova for the largest regional Pokédex. Meanwhile, having gained 3 new entries and only losing 1, Kalos still retains the title of smallest regional Pokédex with 74 entries compared to its original 72, although Sinnoh is now a close second after losing 30 cross-regional evolutions and not gaining any new additions, bringing its new total to 77. Alola had the smallest change out of all dexes, as it has no cross-regional evolutions added or removed, and the only regional form gained was of Hisuian Decidueye. Thanks for watching this kinda weird video. A bit of housekeeping before I go.
That was brilliant, Ken, with me. Very much enjoyed.
I also think it's criminal that the Pokédex has now just been reduced to a sentient creature in a smartphone, but that's a... I probably shouldn't throw that unless I know that it's going to be landing on something soft. I really hope I don't break my phone doing this, because I've realised this is a really funny bit, but I really need to make sure I land it on the sofa.